picture this, a burning ship. It's slowly sinking into an Alabama river. I mean, it's like a scene straight out of a movie, right? But this is no Hollywood fiction. This is the Clotilda, the last known American slave ship. And on today's deep dive, we're going to uncover its story. A story as captivating as it is heartbreaking.
Yeah, it's a powerful story.
It is. We're going to explore not only the history of the Clotilda itself, but also the lives of the people it carried and the legacy that, well, it continues to this day, you know? It's a sensitive topic, of course,
Yeah,
and we're going to be approaching it with the respect it deserves.
absolutely.
Now, to help guide us through this complex history, we have a historian specializing in transatlantic slavery and African diasporic culture, and their insights are, I mean, they're just fascinating as we kind of unpack this chapter of American history
Yeah.
that, well, to be honest, is often overlooked.
It really forces us to confront the brutal reality of the slave trade, even after it was officially outlawed.
Yeah, and speaking of outlawed, to understand the Clotilda, we really need to first understand the world it kind of sailed into. It's the early 1800s. The slave trade has been widely banned, but it's thriving in the shadows. It's mind-blowing.
Yeah, about a quarter of all Africans trafficked across the Atlantic were actually trafficked after the bans were in place. So this wasn't, a handful of small, isolated incidents. This was a vast, brutal industry that was driven by profit and the demand for cheap labor.
And this is all happening, against this backdrop of a booming slave system within the U.S. I mean, think about it. The enslaved population in the South went from 700,000 in 1790 to a staggering 4 million by 1860. I mean, that's an almost seven-fold increase in just 70 years.
Yeah, and despite the ban on importing enslaved people from Africa, the internal slave trade within the U.S. just exploded.
Wow.
It was fueled by the expansion of cotton plantations and this just insatiable demand for labor. What's particularly chilling about this internal trade is that it was a brutal industrial process.
So essentially, even though it was illegal to bring enslaved people from Africa, the system was perpetuating itself within the U.S.
Yeah.
What did this industrial process, what did it actually look like?
Well, think about slave auctions,
Yeah.
where families were torn apart, forced migrations, where people were marched hundreds of miles to new plantations, and of course, the constant threat of violence and exploitation. This wasn't just about economics. This was a deliberate system of dehumanization, treating people as commodities to be bought and sold and exploited. This lifelong enslavement was passed down through generations, creating this cycle of oppression that is truly horrifying to contemplate.
Yeah, it's a really dark chapter.
It is.
And now let's shift our focus to the specific story of the Clotilda. As you might have guessed, it all starts with a wager, a bet with absolutely devastating consequences.
Yeah. Our main players are Timothy Meaher, a wealthy mobile businessman who owns steamboats, and Captain William Foster, the man at the helm of the Clotilda.
Now here's where it gets interesting. Meaher, a staunch supporter of slavery, made a bet that he could smuggle enslaved Africans into the U.S. right under the noses of authorities. I mean, it sounds like something out of a movie, but it was all too real. And we're not talking about a, spur-of-the-moment dare here. This was a calculated move. And Meaher wasn't acting alone.
Right. He was part of a network of pro-slavery extremists, individuals who were deeply committed to preserving and expanding the institution of slavery. Among them were figures like Benjamin Rush Jones and Alexander Frederick Given.
Oh, wow, those names ring a bell.
Yeah, you might recognize those names as they were both tied to the secession movement.
Wait, so the people behind the Clotilda were directly connected to the events that would ultimately lead to the Civil War.
Yeah, they were closely associated with William Lowndes Yancey, a prominent figure who championed secession and played a key role in the outbreak of the Civil War. It really makes you realize that the Clotilda wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger story about the political and economic forces that fueled the slave trade and ultimately tore the nation apart.
And the timing of it all is just chilling. The Clotilda arrived in America just months before the start of the Civil War, a war that would finally lead to the abolition of slavery. This final act of defiance, this blatant attempt to perpetuate slavery, happened right on the eve of its demise.
Yeah, it speaks to the desperation and the delusion of those who clung to this inhumane system. Now let's retrace the steps of the Clotilda as it set sail from Mobile, Alabama, bound for the slave port of Whydah in present-day Benin. But as we kind of delve into the details of the journey, it's crucial to remember the human cost, the lives shattered by this illegal act.
Yeah, you're right, because Behind the logistics and the historical context are real people whose stories deserve to be heard. What can you tell us about them?
Well, Meaher purchased 125 people, mostly young, who had been kidnapped from their homes by Dahomey warriors. Imagine being ripped away from everything we know, forced onto a ship headed for a life of servitude in a foreign land. To fully grasp the horror of this, we need to understand the Dahomey's role. They were a powerful kingdom in West Africa who actively participated in the slave trade, raiding villages and capturing people to sell to European traders.
Wow. It adds another layer of complexity to this already devastating story. So they're taken from their homes, sold to Meaher, and then forced to endure the infamous Middle Passage. I've read about it, but for those unfamiliar, can you describe just how horrific that journey actually was?
Yeah, the Middle Passage was the brutal transatlantic voyage that brought enslaved Africans to the Americas. In the case of the Clotilda, over 100 people were crammed into the ship's hold, chained together, and forced to lie on these stacked wooden platforms. Can you imagine the stench of human waste and disease, the stifling heat, the lack of fresh air, and the constant fear? These voyages could take months, and disease was rampant.
And tragically, death was a common occurrence during these voyages.
Indeed. Even on the Clotilda, which was a smaller vessel, at least 7 people perished during the 45-day journey. What's important to remember is that this wasn't unusual. Millions of Africans died during the Middle Passage, their bodies tossed overboard.
It's just heartbreaking to imagine the suffering they endured. So after this horrific journey, the Clotilda finally arrives in Mobile Bay under the cover of darkness. Meaher, desperate to hide the evidence, takes drastic measures.
He orders the ship to be burned and sunk in the Mobile River, attempting to erase any trace of his crime. But the Clotilda's story and the story of the people on board doesn't end there. Despite Meaher's attempt to, destroy the evidence, the Clotilda remained partially visible for decades. It was this haunting reminder of the crime that had taken place.
Yeah, it almost seems unbelievable that Meaher could pull this off. I mean, without anyone noticing, or at the very least facing any real consequences for his actions. What happened there?
Well, it's a complex situation, and there's evidence that suggests that Meaher felt very confident that he wouldn't face any repercussions. He had connections, even friendships, with officials who were, responsible for preventing this type of illegal activity. In fact, there are accounts of a customs officer's daughter marrying one of the Clotilda captives just a few years after they arrived in Mobile.
So are you suggesting that there was a level of complicity within the system that allowed Meaher to operate with impunity?
It's certainly a possibility. These personal relationships, coupled with the prevailing pro-slavery sentiment among, those in power, likely created this network that shielded Meaher from facing justice.
Now, shifting gears a bit, I'm curious to learn more about the Clotilda itself. I understand that it wasn't originally designed to transport people.
You're right, the Clotilda was a schooner, a type of sailing vessel built to haul lumber. You've probably seen images of the massive slave ships from earlier eras, but the Clotilda was considerably smaller. Exactly, and this raises a fascinating question.
Right.
How did they manage to transport over 100 people on a ship meant for cargo? Archaeologists have been studying the Clotilda and have discovered evidence that it might have been used for voyages to Cuba prior to its infamous trip across the Atlantic. There are records of voyages where the cargo isn't specified, and they've noticed that the Clotilda was unusually large for a schooner of its type. Intriguingly, the ship was also insured during this period, which was uncommon for ships like this at that time.
It makes you wonder if the Clotilda had a history of involvement in human trafficking, even before that fateful journey to Africa.
It's a chilling thought, but the evidence suggests it was a possibility, underscoring the fact that the illegal slave trade was more extensive and insidious than we might realize. But for now, let's return to that moment when the Clotilda arrived in Mobile Bay. Remember, Meaher knew he had to act quickly to cover his tracks, so he ordered the ship to be burned and sunk.
He hoped to destroy the evidence, but as you mentioned, the Clotilda remained partially visible for decades, serving as this eerie reminder of the crimes that took place, a tangible symbol of the enduring legacy of slavery.
And then, fast forward to 2018, the Slave Wrecks Project, an organization dedicated to locating and studying slave shipwrecks, made an incredible discovery. After years of meticulous searching, they identified the wreck of the Clotilda in the murky depths of the Mobile River.
It must have been like finding a needle in a haystack. What went into making that discovery possible?
Well, it was a triumph of historical research combined with advanced technology, and yes, a bit of luck. The Clotilda's unique construction and its relatively well-documented history helped to narrow down the search area. They used sonar scans and underwater exploration to carefully piece together the puzzle, ultimately confirming the identity of the wreck.
It's amazing what they were able to accomplish, and it really highlights the importance of preserving these tangible links to our past. You've said it before, but these shipwrecks are more than just pieces of wood and metal.
They are vessels of stories of lives lost and of the enduring legacy of slavery. They provide invaluable clues that help us understand this dark chapter in human history. And in the case of the Clotilda, its discovery brought renewed attention to the stories of its survivors and their descendants. Speaking of the survivors earlier, you mentioned the story of Cujo Lewis, also known by his Yoruba name Kazula. Why has he become such a significant figure in the Clotilda story?
He's considered one of the last surviving members of the Clotilda, and he lived a long life, passing away in 1935.
And what makes his story even more remarkable is that in the late 1920s, he was interviewed by the writer Zoran Neale Hurston. She documented his life story in detail, but for a variety of reasons, her manuscript wasn't published until 2018. Imagine that, a story lost for decades and then rediscovered, offering us this invaluable first-hand account of the entire experience.
It must provide an incredible perspective on his life. His childhood in Africa, the raid that led to his capture, the horrors of the Middle Passage, his years of enslavement, and ultimately his freedom.
It does. It gives voice to someone who endured the unimaginable. And it allows us to connect with the human dimension of this tragedy in a way that statistics and historical accounts simply can't. His story, along with the stories of the other survivors, forces us to confront the realities of this horrific system.
Yeah, it's hard to fathom the pain and trauma they carried with them. Yet they found the strength not only to survive, but to rebuild their lives, create a community, and hold on to their heritage. It's truly inspiring.
And their story doesn't end there. The descendants of the Clotilda survivors are actively working to preserve their ancestors' legacy by sharing their stories and connecting with their ancestral homeland in Benin.
It's incredible to see this cross-cultural exchange bridging the gap between continents and generations. It reinforces the idea that the past isn't truly past. It continues to shape who we are and how we understand the world today.
And it underscores the importance of remembering, of acknowledging the injustices of the past, and of working towards a more just and equitable future. The story of the Clotilda is a multi-layered one. It's about the horrors of slavery. It's also about resilience, the power of community, and the enduring human spirit.
It challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths, to learn from the past, and to work towards a world where such atrocities are never repeated.
And it reminds us that even in the darkest of times, hope and humanity can prevail.
This has been a truly profound and moving deep dive, and we've only just scratched the surface. Welcome back to our deep dive into the story of the Clotilda. I mean, it's been a heavy but important journey as we've uncovered this kind of hidden chapter of American history. We've explored the historical context of the illegal slave trade, the audacity of the individuals who orchestrated this horrific voyage, the resilience of the survivors who built Africa Town, and even the rediscovery of the Clotilda itself.
It's a story filled with twists and turns that at times feel almost too cinematic to believe. But this isn't just a tale of the past. It's a story with profound implications for the present and the future.
You're right. The legacy of the Clotilda and the institution of slavery itself continue to shape our society today. So let's talk about that legacy. What are some of the key takeaways from this story, and how do they connect to the challenges we face in the modern world?
One of the most striking aspects of the Clotilda story, at least for me, is the sheer audacity of Timothy Meaher and his co-conspirators. They knew what they were doing was illegal, not to mention morally reprehensible, and yet they went ahead with it anyway, driven by greed and a belief in their own superiority.
It's a stark reminder that power and privilege can blind people to the basic humanity of others.
Absolutely. And this blindness, this willingness to exploit and dehumanize others for personal gain, is something we still grapple with today. Think about the ways systemic racism and inequality continue to perpetuate injustice and limit opportunities for people of color.
Yeah, it really draws a direct line from the past to the present. And the fact that Meaher essentially got away with his crimes speaks volumes about the systems of power that protected him.
The lack of accountability for those who profited from slavery is a wound that has never fully healed. And we see this wound festering in the form of racial disparities in health, education, and even in our criminal justice system.
So knowing all of this, where do we go from here? How do we acknowledge this painful past and work towards a more just and equitable future?
Well, it all starts with remembering. With refusing to let these stories be forgotten. The discovery of the Clotilda and the renewed interest in its history is a crucial step in that process. It's about giving voice to the voiceless, honoring the memory of those who suffered, and understanding how their experiences continue to shape our world. But remembering is only the first step.
Right. It seems like we also need to actively dismantle the systems of oppression that are still in place today.
Exactly. We need to fight for racial justice, economic equality, and a society that truly values the dignity and worth of every human being.
It's a long and challenging journey, but the story of the Clotilda reminds us that change is possible. The resilience of the survivors who built Africatown is a testament to the power of the human spirit to overcome adversity.
Their story is a source of inspiration and a powerful call to action. It reminds us to never give up hope, to never stop fighting for justice, and to never forget the lessons of the past.
This deep dive into the story of the Clotilda has been a profound experience for me. It stayed with me long after I first learned about it.
And that's the power of stories like this. They have the ability to change us, to make us more aware of the injustices of the past, and more determined to create a better future.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a question to ponder. What can you learn from the story of the Clotilda? And how can you apply those lessons to the challenges you face in your own life and in the world around you?
It's a question worth reflecting on. The story of the Clotilda isn't just a historical artifact. It's a living reminder of the ongoing struggle for justice and equality. It's a story that has the power to inspire, to challenge, and to guide us towards a more just and compassionate world.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the story of the Clotilda. We hope you'll continue to explore this fascinating and important chapter of American history.